You're listening to the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and I'm back after a bit of a break. My apologies to those who have been staring at the empty feed. Many reasons for that: podcast award entries, funding applications, all the kind of stuff that is always going on in the background happened to now condense into late spring, early summer. But the show must go on, and the show will go on. For the summer heat, we have a special 2-episode series looking at how climate, weather, the rains, and the heat have shaped human story at 2 critical junctures. In the second episode, we're going to look at the origins of European colonialism. But in this first one, we're going to go much deeper into the misty past. We're going to grapple with human evolution, and we're going to look at how an ancient climate change played a role in that. This is the famous savanna hypothesis, according to which the South and North American continents linking up, joining each other, blocking the ocean currents from the Pacific to the Atlantic, created a climate shift in Africa around 3 million years ago, which pushed our ancestors out from the forest and into the savanna, thereby kickstarting all sorts of things from meat eating to tool use and brain growth. I never fail to mention, if there is an appropriate slot to mention it in, long-time listeners will have noticed. But it is not a story which is universally accepted. At least if you say savanna hypothesis, there's going to be a lot of serious scholars who say, hold on a second, that is not accurate anymore. And so I wanted to dedicate a full episode to the details around this scholarship. My guest is Jessica Thompson from Yale University, who works also there at the Peabody Museum. And she's someone who indeed thinks that the original savanna hypothesis is not really what we should go to anymore, but agrees, as I do, that some kind of a refined story is certainly an important part of the human story. So what we do in this episode is that we look at the whole 7 million years of human evolution, paying attention to what's happening in the climate, to the extent that we know what's happening to the climate, and how that plays into human evolution generally, and especially the peculiar growth of the human brain. So in this way, this will complement the 5-episode series, The Origins of Humankind, from earlier this spring. I hope that you enjoy this. If you do, you can support the show just by hitting the subscribe button, if you haven't done so yet, hitting the 5-star button if you think that I deserve it, and sharing the show if you think that people might enjoy it. And as always, before we get started, just a warm thank you to the rapidly growing group of people who are supporting this work at patreon.com/onhumans. Your contributions really not only make me smile, but also make me pay the bills that go into producing this show. Thank you so much. It really, really means a lot. So this episode is for you. And without further ado, I bring you Jessica Thompson. Professor Jessica Thompson, welcome to On Humans.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Around 7 million years ago, there almost certainly was some kind of an ape species wandering somewhere in the world that branched into 2 lineages, one leading to chimpanzees, bonobos, one leading to us humans. We've never found the missing link fossil or anything, but we know theoretically it must have existed. Is there anything we can say about that creature?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit we can say about that creature, because we can look at the commonalities that the 2 end members have, which is the way that we would go about reconstructing the many, many instances in the fossil record where we don't have necessarily an example of the exact organism that we're interested in. And some of those commonalities are ones that humans share with all of the other apes. And that's going to be already a group of creatures that had, that had pretty big investment in a large brain size, because that's a characteristic of all the apes. And we've just kind of taken that to an extreme. And we have to be thinking about this, of course, in the ecological and environmental context of the time, in which that would have been one of the largest brain sizes relative to the body size of any organism that was walking around terrestrially on the landscape. And so we can say that they were smart. I think we can already say they were smart. When we use ourselves as the points of comparison and we look backwards, it's different than when we're trying to think about that moment in time. And we don't have ourselves yet existing to compare to. So,
do we know about the environment? Do we know anything about where this creature lived?
There's a long history of debate about exactly where the source population of the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees would have lived. And the debate's gotten a little bit, it's kind of cyclical in a way, as many scientific debates tend to do. So you kind of start out with sometimes, can I use an example that's not from human origins?
Absolutely.
For example, we think about the idea of Darwinian evolution, evolution by natural selection. And before there was that theory, there were a number of other people who attempted to try to explain how you can get the diversity of life. And the one that people often think of is Lamarck. And he had ideas that you would actually be able to change through behavior during your lifespan, something about your body, and then you would pass that on to.
So the giraffe is really trying really hard to reach the upper branches, so the neck grows and yeah.
Always the giraffe picture, but
Yes.
it was considered wrong and wrong-headed in a way. So it wasn't just, okay, that was a, not actually the way that evolution works, but it was considered, kind of, almost condescendingly, like he was just so wrong. And yet, when we look today, we're seeing epigenetics is teaching us that there are, in fact, things that organisms do in their lifespan, what we eat, how we behave, the stress that we experience, and that leaves a mark on our genome, which we actually can pass on to our offspring under certain conditions for multiple generations. So it's not exactly the way Lamarck envisioned it happening, but it is kind of one of those things where we can't take these older ideas and completely disregard that they haven't got maybe some elements of creativity or truth to them or something that's worth pursuing. And I think that when it comes to understanding where a lot of the debates in paleoanthropology come from, they take a kind of a similar cycle where you have someone proposes something when there's very little evidence to be used that could actually test that. Then some evidence starts to accumulate, and then it turns out maybe that that's not actually a very good explanation. And instead of dismissing the whole thing completely, what often tends to happen is it kind of creeps back in some new way.
So what would be a theory that's creeping back?
Well, the theory that's creeping back is, I think, that we know that Darwin also suggested that the ultimate homeland of all humans must have been on the African continent because we have the most anatomical similarities between humans and chimpanzees and gorillas, and chimps and gorillas live in Africa. So that's the fundamental kind of reasoning there.
And so the missing link would have been living somewhere in Africa.
So we used to, I think, be very confident saying definitely somewhere in Africa, somewhere in the tropical rainforest of Africa is where that population that eventually split into chimps and humans would have lived. And I think most researchers would still say that. But there is also kind of a revisitation of this idea that there were widespread ape populations all the way across and around northern Africa and circum-Mediterranean region.
Even in Germany, modern day Germany, right? They had some apes walking around 10 million years ago or so. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of apes in Europe. And well, what it means is it could mean one of two things. It could mean that the environment was just so different that, I mean, because let's look at where apes live today. They live in tropical rainforests. That's orangutans, that's gibbons. Those are the small apes that often get forgotten, but they're also apes.
Yeah.
And then, there's the so-called great apes, which are the orangutans and the gorillas and the chimpanzees. And they all live in the tropical rainforests of either Africa or in Indonesia. You could argue, okay, well, maybe all of these apes were living all the way across Eurasia because there was a tropical rainforest there. Or you could take it the other way and you could say maybe there was just a much, much greater diversity of places that apes were adapted to live in that particular moment. And it doesn't necessarily have to have been a tropical rainforest, but whatever the habitat was, it was supporting not just a lot of apes, but a lot of different types of apes. And so the fossil record seems to be pointing to quite a bit of diversity in the body sizes, in the ways they moved around, the parts of the forest, because for the most part, there probably were still forest, at least woodland adapted. And because of that, it kind of makes it harder to understand what type of ape would have been the most likely last common ancestor. So it kind of is getting a little more complicated thinking about, does it have to have been in deep in the tropical rainforest of Africa, or might it have been some other kind of ape that we haven't found yet?
Well, okay. So basically, the missing link is still very much missing, both in as a fossil, but also in theory. One question, by the way, before we move on: the fascinating findings of these ape fossils from Europe all the way, even in southern Germany. Um, do we have any idea about the climate of those areas during that time?
Yeah, I want to say that we do, but I also want to say that I don't study this particular time period very closely. In broad terms, this is the time we think of. I mean, geologically, it's called the Miocene. So it's the age of apes, and you get the first apes appearing in the fossil record, and they're in the early Miocene. In the middle Miocene, they flourish, and then the late Miocene, they start to diminish. And the late Miocene is also the first time that we get the first upright walking apes that we would consider hominins as a part of the bit that split off from chimpanzees. So the hominins are all of that group going back to the split point. So the hominins are everything on kind of our side of the family tree. And so the first hominins also appear in the late Miocene. And that's a pretty sparsely sampled fossil record overall. And so it's hard to kind of look at large scale patterns in where different species of any kind lived, because geologically the deposits are just not that well represented. And sometimes you get geological deposits, but they're not like the right kind of rock to preserve fossils. And then you're just going to get a lot of variation in the environment. But we do know that around that time, in kind of the middle to late Miocene, there was definitely a massive reconfiguration of the climate around the Mediterranean area. And the Mediterranean itself became very tiny and in fact cut off from the sea at one point. So all of this had to have had something to do with a big change in environment and the kinds of habitats where all of these various apes were living. And then we know that they were gone by the end of the Miocene. So they live on in small pockets today, the chimps and the gorillas, and then the ones from island Southeast Asia, so the orangutans and the gibbons. So they seem to have managed to kind of survive in those types of habitats, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only type of habitat that all apes have ever been well adapted to live in.
So would it be right to say that there was probably a world of a lot of apes around maybe 10 million years ago across Africa, Eurasia, and then there is some kind of a climate change? We don't exactly know the details. We haven't studied it that closely, but we can just summarize it at least in one sentence. But there is something happening, and a lot of these apes probably become dead ends evolutionarily, and the ones that remain are those in certain pockets of Africa, Southeast Asia, and of course us, which have then spread everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a pretty good summary.
Okay. Well, you said something really important earlier. If we now move on, you said something that they were probably still living very much in rainforests or in forests. And I think that's a kind of a nod towards the well-known fact that at some point, some of our ancestors became very comfortable living on the savanna. And that is another big debate of when that happens, how important that is. And I think we should talk a little bit about that just to get the timeline right. If 6 to 7 million years ago is when we have the last common ancestor with chimpanzees, the next maybe the big milestone would maybe be the origins of our genus Homo, the first species that we call humans. And that would be a little bit, roughly halfway, a little bit less, like what is like 2.5 million, maybe even 3 million years ago.
Yeah, that's about right. And actually what I think might be worth saying for your listeners is, if they're wondering, okay, the so-called missing link, there's no fossil of it. Well, let me tell you why. One is going to be preservation, because fossils don't preserve in all the places we would love them to preserve. So if this was a woodland adapted or especially tropical rainforest adapted last common ancestor, those are the worst possible environments in existence for the preservation of fossils.
Yes, yes. Oh, yeah. Everything just gets eaten in the rainforest.
So do those fossils exist? Maybe not. Maybe they just never actually became fossilized. The other possibility is research effort, because it's pretty uneven, and it could be that if such fossils did exist, they might eventually be found, but at the moment we haven't, because quite frankly, Africa is a huge place and it has not got that many researchers doing work there. And there are certain places that, because of geopolitical tension, or because of the infrastructure, or because of the actual like climate itself in today's world, it's just too hard to work in certain places, and so coverage is really uneven. And so they might be wondering, well, then how the heck can we be confident that between 7 and 8 million years ago is the time period? And that's going to be based on molecular evidence. So study after study after study showing that the time period in which we can reconstruct the last common ancestor existing, where we can take the genome of chimpanzees and bonobos and the genomes of humans, and we can actually compare them to each other and count backwards the number of generations it would have taken to actually have that amount of difference. That's how we come to that number. And that's why it's a big range.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let's go into this period that we do have evidence about. So very roughly say 3 million years ago, a little bit less. We have the Austrolopithecines, like the famous Lucy. We don't know exactly which Australopithecine branch then becomes the first species that merits the word Homo. And that whole debate, I think, is maybe not what we should focus on, who was the first human, but what happens in that transition when we start getting more and more towards creatures that everyone kind of calls humans. We get a new epoch. We get the Pleistocene, meaning the climate has changed dramatically. We roughly around the time we also see new kind of tools. So one theory has been, which is a very neat theory, which is we have a climate change which destroys a lot of wooden environments. You start having a lot of more grasslands, savanna lands, and the creatures who are able to thrive there have to walk upright, have to use tools in hunting, whatever, and there you get the whole package of being human. That's such a simplified story that I'm sure that it's kind of wrong, but just how wrong is that story, do you think?
No, so you've just described the savanna hypothesis, and so we can talk about, first of all, what a savanna is, and what a savanna is. Maybe I should ask you a question. What do you think of when somebody says the African savanna?
I think of the Serengeti plains.
Yes, everybody does. Who hasn't spent a lot of time in other kinds of savannas, right? Because a savanna can be many things. It it's typically got more open than closed components to it, but it can have a lot of woodland pockets, and particularly along what we call the riparian corridors. So where you have rivers, you're going to have trees, sometimes very tall trees, and you can get completely different kinds of species living in that particular part of the savanna than the ones, that are going to be more open habitat. And you can also have grasslands that are quite bushy, quite wooded, and they're going to have a lot of different characteristics. For example, today's thickets in Africa, you get tsetse fly, and tsetse fly carries trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness. And when you're out in the open, you don't necessarily have so much of that. So there's all these different kind of things that probably mattered quite a bit, that are really complicated and difficult to reconstruct under this umbrella of a savanna.
So basically, there would be a kind of hardline savanna hypothesis, is the naive idea that are two ecosystems. There is the jungle, and then there is the Serengeti plain, and there is a wall in the middle. And on the one side, you have chimpanzees, and on the other side, you have humans. But I'm hearing you say, am I right that what you're suggesting is, well, it's much more complicated than that. But if we take a more broad view of what the savanna is like, there might be something to be said in favor of the fact that humans evolved to be more adapted to the savanna landscape. Is that right?
I do think that what humans do well is they are they're good at exploiting lots and lots of kinds of environments. And this is what we know about modern humans. They really can live everywhere, just everywhere. And they do it, of course, through technology and cooperation. These are the biggest tools in the toolkit that humans have. And that links to some of our biological tools, like having a large brain and having handy hands, and then walking upright. There's many different, I should say, have been many different hypotheses about why that would have initially emerged. But at the end of the day, it does help us in many ways with things like tool use and freeing hands, even if that's not originally why it came about. It certainly has facilitated that. And so there are certain things where it's kind of like we don't necessarily know exactly why the first, let's say, the first time or the first reasoning behind it, but they've become very useful adaptations that we have. And they today make humans very good at living anywhere humans want to live and in enormous numbers. And I think that part of when we go back in time and try to think about the transition of humans into the kind of creature that was so good at doing many things, and when did that actually happened? When did we sort of free ourselves from the constraints of the environment more than other species did? I think that's maybe one of the most interesting stories about us. I personally think that we were already seeing evidence of this with Australopithecus. And the reason for that is because you find their fossils where you expect to find fossils, where fossils preserve. And that is in a wider variety of environments than tropical rainforests. So they're out there in places where you at least don't get chimpanzees.
So drier or more open, perhaps savanna-like habitats more than chimpanzees.
Yeah, more open habitats. You find them out on floodplains. So these would have been areas where there would have been lots of different kinds of predators, less tree cover, and it was just not the same sort of set of challenges, I guess, that you would be facing if you were in a more closed woodland or tropical rainforest. So you see the fossils showing up in a wider variety of environments, and then you also see that when you do a geochemical analysis of the teeth, there's quite a wide array of things that they must have been eating. But it does show that whereas the older hominins, so before about 3 million years ago, their geochemical signals seem to be pointing to more of a woodland kind of diet. So they're eating fruits. And then when you get later in time, after 3 million years ago, um, in fact, I should say about 3.5 million years ago, by then you already see that there's quite a range in what they're eating. So I think that's just telling us that they're getting better at doing lots of different things. And by being a generalist, this is a very common ecological principle that generalists are pretty good at adapting to change around them because they just have fewer constraints.
Well, then, do we know anything about what happened 3.5 million years ago in terms of, for example, climate, new tools, new behaviors? Do we have anything more to say than, well, look, we look at the teeth and they seem to be eating something new? Can we link it to anything that was happening around them? Because the big climate change, big climate change that creates the whole Pleistocene epoch and the everything that comes with that comes only later.
Yeah. For the start of the Pleistocene is officially about 2.6 million years ago, and this is the ice ages, right? So it's not just one huge cold global ice age. Of course, it's cycles of glaciation, and then the glaciers recede. And overall, yeah, there's definitely more open habitat opening up globally and certainly across Africa. So there is a need to adapt to these new challenges.
And that matches so well with the origin of, say, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, these Homo species, right? It's almost simultaneous. I can't remember exactly the dates, but would you say that it's almost kind of in lockstep with this climate change?
This is why this has been such a powerful narrative for so long, because it really seemed to be, up until, let's say, 15 years ago, all of the evidence was pointing to the start of the ice ages at about the same time, geologically simultaneous with the first tool use, stone tool use, with the emergence of the genus Homo. So the first fossils of the genus Homo, of which we're obviously a part, and then also with the earliest evidence for carnivory. So this is the actual like use of those stone tools to cut meat off of bones. And then, so there's this idea that there was this huge dietary shift. There was the emergence of a new species, and that's, the genus Homo with lots of different species in it. But at that time, it was not really, I don't know how to say this. I guess the nuance to it seemed almost inevitable that we shouldn't need nuance because it all just looked so clear. And then all this stuff started to change. in terms of what we actually know about the fossil record. And it started about, I would say, 2010.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm biased because I was tangentially involved in this, but this is the controversial evidence from the Dakika site in Ethiopia of hominin cutting meat off of bones of big animals at 3.4 million years ago. So this is almost a million years older than what had previously been like the oldest record. So it seemed like such a neat package, right? You get the start of the ice ages. It comes along with all this expanding open habitat. And into this walks the earliest homo, and he or she is holding a stone tool in one hand, like animal in the other, right? This
And humanity is born.
and that's humanity's born. Yeah, what you have is the challenge that's always there with this, like, the evidence is there, but you don't necessarily have equivalent amounts of evidence before and after because of just how those same things, fossil preservation and then also research effort. And the argument was that in 2010, when a group of researchers published this paper in Nature saying that there were marks on bones that were 3.4 million years old and indicated clearly that meat had been removed by a tool from these bones, that this was not homo, that there was Austrolopithecus or whatever came before homo was the first meat eater, right? Meat eater and stone tool user, but there were no stone tools at that site. And so it's controversial and has been back and forth debates about whether or not they really are marks from stone tools
Or from crocodile teeth.
right. And so then this has been quite an interesting moment because by some people are arguing, well, no, this has just changed the paradigm. What this does is it shows you that when you actually go out and you look for these tiny little traces on bones that you would otherwise have ignored, you see all of the stuff that's just been there to be found all along. And it really changes the story. And other people are saying it doesn't change the story at all because we still have to be able to demonstrate convincingly that there is no other explanation for how these marks got on the bones. And so, the debate kind of goes back and forth. But it's not just about that, just kind of started things off. What happened then was 5 years later, there were stone tools that were reported, and this was from Kenya, and they're 3.3 million years old. So this is like, okay, well, maybe there weren't stone tools at the same site in Ethiopia where these marks are found on the bones, but there are old stone tools from that time period. And those stone tools don't look quite the same as what we get at 2.6 million. And so it's kind of still in that tension. We are still at this moment in that tension between where are all of the other sites? How actually widespread was this behavior? And we know later it became very, very important to the human adaptation to use tools and also to, go out and hunt and acquire large game, right? We know that this was later on very important, but how important was it to Australopiths? Was it an occasional behavior? Was it a pre-adaptation? Was it the start of this big revolution? And
Because there could be there could be a in-between theory, which is that just in the same way as, when Jane Goodall first recorded chimpanzees using tools, it was like, okay, so humans are not the only creatures that can use tools. A chimpanzee can use a tool to fish for termites. But, we do depend more on tools than chimpanzees, and we make much more elaborate tools. Maybe this could this just be a similar story where, okay, it's not like the first stone tool was made by the first human, but it was a sporadic activity before with the human ancestors, Austrolopithecins, and then it became a much more kind of part and parcel of what the species does and depends on to get the calories they need.
I think that the evidence is still so sparse that it's really hard to be able to say. And something I've been thinking about lately is about how entrenched some of these narratives get, not just when they kind of make it out into the public and need to be by necessity for teaching, also summarized in a way that kind of makes sense. Because if you try to present something that's overly complicated to somebody who's not a specialist, it just doesn't.
Yeah.
You just defeat the whole purpose, right, of trying to convey information because it's too complicated. And the closer you are to the material, the more complicated you tend to think about it. And so there's this problem of trying to be able to say something that's meaningful, somewhat accurate, or hopefully very accurate, but also is simple enough to be comprehensible. And what's been bothering me lately is that these narratives are entrenched also in the academic literature, and the framing that researchers in this area use to talk about what is and isn't important about the things that they're doing. So if you want to think about a new discovery of some fossils somewhere or some stone tools somewhere, all of this literature around the importance of meat eating and tool use and the expansion of brain size that came with the first representatives of the genus Homo, those three things are kind of always somewhere in the mix, right? They're always there in the narrative, and they feel like they make sense. You have a big, expensive brain with Homo, and you have to be able to feed it. And that means there's a dietary change somewhere, somehow. There's more energy coming out of the environment and into that organism than there was before, somehow. And there's been so many hypotheses. Is it tool use? Is it, fire? Is it chewing? What is it? But regardless of what it is, it was there. Something happened. But when you dig into the actual realities of the fossil record, we know that the first described fossil of our genus Homo is 2.8 million years old. And it comes from Ethiopia. And it is 1/2 of the lower jaw. And that does not come with a brain size. That fossil does not have an estimate for brain size. We are able to assign it confidently to Homo on the basis of tiny little attributes of the teeth that are probably not of interest to the people listening. But so what's up with the brain size? We know that there's a dietary change, probably based on the fact that the teeth are different. But how that relates to brain size is pretty unclear until we actually have a fossil that gives us a brain size estimate.
But we do know that the Austrolopithecus brain is already bigger than the chimpanzee brain. Not that much bigger, but substantially bigger, like 20% or something, right?
It's on the larger size of a chimpanzee brain. So basically, different subpopulations of chimpanzees have different average brain sizes. And then it's not just the size of the brain, but it's the size of the brain relative to the body that it has to manage. And yeah, so Australopiths already had bigger brains than you would expect for their brain size if they were being compared to chimpanzees.
Yeah, and don't they have also bigger brain size than like Ardipithecus or something that came before them? So there seems to be something around, again, that 3.5 million or whatever time that seems to put the Australopiths to be kind of this middle way on the way towards what we know so comfortably as our ancestors, these big-brained bipedal creatures who definitely eat meat. Would it be right to say that, well, we don't know exactly how the transition goes, but it kind of something has to happen there somewhere, which increases the brain size, whether rapidly or slowly?
Yes, I definitely think so. And the difference is that when you get the first representatives of Homo with the brain size, that's a lot bigger than an Australopith's brain. And so if you kind of try to map it out, it kind of doesn't look like a gradual brain size increase. It looks more like there's a couple of different moments when it sort of gets bigger faster. My personal view is that it's part of this adaptation of being pretty good with tool use, probably a lot of it that doesn't preserve sticks and things like that. Exploiting new habitats, probably having to be more social in that context, and more cooperative, potentially getting involved in the consumption of new kinds of foods like bone marrow, which takes you out into new habitats where it's more commonly available, puts you in competition with carnivores. Like there's all sorts of things going on around 3.5 that I think are important.
But so we do know that halfway on the journey from the missing link, the last common ancestor with chimpanzees and us, halfway we already have these Australopiths that have somewhat bigger brain. They seem to be eating a little bit more varied of a diet, not just fruit and leaves. They might even be using tools. It seems that some of them were using tools, but they were very, very much not an early human. They were very much the kind of in between. And then around the same time as we have this massive climate change, the beginning of the ice ages, etc., we start having creatures that we're more comfortable calling humans, and they have a much bigger brain. And now the question is, how do all of these things fit together?
Yeah, like what you just described is exactly how it is thought commonly that all of this happened. But the nuance comes in with the fossil record and the fact that at 2.8 million years ago we have Homo, and then at 2.6 million years ago we have the start of the Pleistocene. All right, so Homo emerges before the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is, climate is always changing over time, and there has been an overall increase in grasslands. There's been an overall increase in the kind of amount of change that you get with climate cycles. It's always kind of changing. So there's this like broad directional trend towards a colder world, but at the same time, there's cycles within it. So yeah, the first Homo emerges before the Pleistocene, but it's also kind of coming at the tail end of something that's leading into the Pleistocene too. So you can't think of the Pleistocene as just a wall either.
Yeah, I see. So would you be happy to say that 2.8 million years ago, when you have the first Homo, is more Pleistocene like than say 3.5 or 4 or whatever? Like we're already kind of knocking on the door of the Pleistocene.
I would say that that's going to be a pretty good way to think about it, because if we're thinking at like 3.5 million years ago with Australopithecus, and they're already ranging out into more open habitats, but those habitats just keep getting more and more open overall. And then you start to get these big global cycles. But then the other problem is that that early specimen of Homo, like I said, doesn't have a brain size associated with it. So we know that there's a change in the teeth, which tells us has been a change in the diet. But we don't actually know if that change in the diet has translated to an increase in brain size until we actually get the next available brain that we can measure, which is like 2 million years ago. So we have an 800,000 year gap between the first fossil we can assign to Homo on the basis of its teeth and the first fossil of Homo to which we actually know its brain size. So that to me feels like a black box that's under acknowledged.
Which makes, I guess, finding any hard evidence on why the brain increases or how do we feed the increasing brain much more difficult, because you can't pinpoint the moment. This is where it happens. This is where the big burst of brain growth happens. What happened right then? We don't know. Is that what you're saying?
It is, and I suspect that's probably why it looks like such a big bump in brain size increase, is because there's a big gap.
I see. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So if you only measure someone when they're 1 year old and when they're 20 year old, there's a big growth spurt suddenly, but it's actually quite gradual.
So these are details that are maybe really they might feel kind of arcane and not that important to people who are trying to kind of disentangle it all. But the overall narrative is one in which you have got a backdrop of changing climates. It is important. Global climate change mattered. But the story, if you kind of try to zoom out and look at it, is one in which our, let's call it just our lineage. So we don't want to necessarily say particular species or that one or whatever, but just the groups of hominins going from Australopithecus to us have been on a couple of big trajectories with respect to their relationship to the environment. One of them is that they seem to be becoming increasingly flexible at using tools and cooperative behavior to be able to just live in more different kinds of habitats and spread in more different types of habitats. So they have access to more available ecological space than other organisms do. They're going to be coming into competition with them, and we don't know necessarily what consequences that might have had.
Yeah, yeah. And isn't that trend something that continues all the way until today, in that if you look at early humans, they are much more restricted to certain kind of early like pre-sapiens humans. They are much more restricted in terms of the niche, the ecological niche they live in. And then with the evolution of humans, the possible habitats gets broader and broader and broader until we are, having folks living on the International Space Station.
Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly right. So we just keep getting better at doing that. And I like to think of this as one aspect of the other piece to what we've been doing, which is increasingly taking more control over our environments
Yes.
and manipulating them to serve our needs. So you kind of have this, if you look way back and kind of look at the origin of Homo and you go back even to Australopithecus, I kind of imagine this as all part of one big trajectory, not a trajectory in the sense that there was some goal at the end and we were it. But it's one of those things where once you get into this kind of capacity to generate more and more available food for yourself, either through exploiting entirely new types of resources or through basically engineering your environment to be able to provide more resources out of the same area. What you're able to do then is just get yourself on a pathway where you can keep doing more and more and more of it. And at the kind of end member of that, you have us, and we are incredibly dominant species, and we've become incredibly dominant very quickly in geological time. But I think there's a longer story. And, of course, it was going to be not always at the scale that we do it now, but I think it's all kind of part of the same story. And there have been these kind of moments along the way when there have been major changes in our biology that are necessary for some of this stuff to have happened. But they connect, I think, in this kind of overall story of being the organism that can just always adapt and then eventually adapt its own environment to itself.
Did our ancestors, early Homo, did they modify their environment, do you think?
I think that it's hard to know specifically, but when you have a smart tool user on the landscape that is able to kind of move around into different habitats and know in advance where they probably should be at what points in time, they're going to be at least positioning themselves to be able to get more from that environment. And then the question becomes, at what point are they actually changing that environment? There are some ideas that through competition, they may have done so. We know that there's a big reduction in the diversity of large carnivores, for example, around 3.5 million years ago. So going into the Pleistocene, overall, there's actually kind of a trend towards less and less diversity. And then in the Pleistocene, you get this less and less diversity. That is one of the ideas that's out there. So I think that whenever you get a new organism that rapidly encroaches into another organism's niche, and it's taken that organism a long time to evolve into it, I think that the new one is going to have the advantage.
Well, I mean, of course, we Homo sapiens, we are probably the human that, or almost certainly the Homo species that modifies our environment the most. And I want to get to us in just a moment. But before that, we do have to talk about how did we feed that brain, whether it was a gradual increase, whether it was a sudden increase. Yeah, I mean, the brain takes what, 20-25% of all of our energy. There must have been a new food source or a way of processing food. I know that you believe in bone marrow having played a role.
I do. I think so. So one of my former mentors from long ago, Kim Hill, it talks a lot about this idea of extracted resources. And so an extracted resource is like, if you think about a landscape, there's the obvious things that you can eat, and then there's the things that take a little bit more work to get into. So an extracted resource is going to be encased foods, something that's inside a nut, something that's inside a shell, something that requires digging.
You have to be a smart tool user to get to it.
Right. And what you see is that what humans are in is they're in this, like what he calls the hunted and extracted niche. And this means that we can live in the same habitat as lots of other organisms and still get more out of that environment. I think bone marrow is one of those early ways in which we accessed a very rich extracted resource that wasn't available to the majority of other organisms.
Can you paint the picture? Who found it from where, how?
What I always imagine is that you have groups of Australopiths and they're kind of in woodlands. I imagine open woodlands.
Half forest, half savanna.
Yeah, and they're kind of venturing out into more proper grasslands, and they're looking for a wide range of resources that are kind of easy to find and easy to pick up. And then I imagine they come across some dead animal and it's got big bones, and they at some point realize that if you hit those bones open, there's something really tasty inside. And this is something that is very easy for chimps to discover in, captive situations. If you put a treat inside a bone and then, just leave them to it and they know the treat's in there, they will smash it open. So we know that the ability, right, that to think about, okay, if the trick is like recognizing that thing that you want, that's actually inside that, and that it's worth the effort of you putting effort into it to get it. So we know that the relationship between technology and kind of, I guess, decision making is that technology lowers the amount of effort that you have to put into something, then it becomes worth your while. And then you go for it. So if you have a new technology and that technology is as simple as here's a rock and I can use it to break this bone, then you've immediately lowered the cost of accessing that resource. And that makes it become extremely attractive very quickly.
And what kind of benefits would bone marrow give to whoever is consuming it when it comes to the things that you need if you want to become a homo very soon?
Bone marrow is, I always think of it as like a stick of butter, and everybody likes a stick of butter. But it is even more wonderful to have a stick of butter when there are no sticks of butter around. And what I mean by that is that the majority of wild ungulates, and especially African ungulates, are very, very lean. And they do have seasonal cycles of kind of where they put on some more fat, but it's not like in your higher latitudes where they get quite fat because they got a short winter.
Oh, so you don't get enough fats if you're just eating the meat, especially for brain growth, which is not so much protein, but fat based.
Right. So you basically put yourself on a high protein diet.
Okay. And you don't want to be on a high protein diet when you're not going to the gym, but rather trying to evolve to be homo. Is that right?
You don't want to be on a high protein diet when, if you eat too much protein, it will eventually cause you to lose weight rather than gain weight.
Yeah.
So the pathways, the biological pathways for actually metabolizing protein, fats, and carbs are different. And people who are into this for, as you mentioned, the gym or for whatever reason, they know that the macronutrient proportions, proteins, fats, and carbs, they matter. It's not just about the numbers of calories that they actually produce. And over a certain amount, you can actually experience protein toxicity, and it can cause liver damage.
Except if you're a cat.
Yeah, well, and we're not cats.
Yes. Like Richard Wrangham has his argument where, look, you're just not gonna, if you don't cook your meat, you're not gonna get enough bioavailable calories without spending all your time just eating to grow the brain of our size. And so fire plays a massive role in that story. But then the problem is that, well, we don't have the evidence yet, at least for early enough fire use for that to explain the early start of the brain growth. Could the bone marrow kind of fill the slot there by being, look, this is great, even if you don't cook it, you can still get enough calories from a small bunch. Because just intuitively, when I think of eating fatty things like bone marrow, it does feel like something you could just eat more than a very chewy bit of completely raw meat. But I might be wrong. So where do you think, am I wrong?
I think that one of the most entertaining papers I ever read was the one where they had a bunch of undergraduates chewing meat and then measuring the caloric consumption. Like the ones that got the raw meat, I don't know, it took them a long time to get through that. I think that if I just look at the evidence for fire, the oldest evidence that I feel compelled by is about 1.5 million years old.
Which is nowhere near old enough for the Wrangham style argument that this is what caused the brain growth.
But our brains don't stop growing with early Homo, right? They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they get a lot bigger.
So maybe bone marrow is what explains why Lucy had a 20% bigger brain than your average chimpanzee, but fire is what explains of how you get to the sapiens Neanderthal style humongous brain.
Potentially, yeah. It's all about lowering costs. You get more for less, and there's lots of different ways you can get more for less. You can try a totally new food that you never had access to before that's really calorie dense. And then there's other ways you can do it. You can lower costs in other ways through technology like fire.
But you don't think that we have a huge amount of fires before 1.5 million years ago that we just haven't discovered, and because of it's difficult to see them?
That's a good question. Fire is so hard to identify. It is so hard to identify. And there's also so much natural fire that's difficult to pick apart.
Yeah, because it could be that it's not that you have a fire where you cook the carcass you hunted. It might be that you walk into a wildfire area and find literally cooked animals and start exploiting them, right?
Yeah, and it's there's this issue of making fire versus carrying fire versus finding fire. All of those could have been important adaptations along the way. But if you've ever actually sat and tried to make a fire and it's not something that somebody is teaching you to do, it's a really, really, really complicated thing to do. You have to, I don't know that anyone would actually like just happen upon that themselves.
So it would make sense that you first become dependent on wildfires, and then if you don't have them, you're so desperate that you kind of find a way. It would make more sense that you just strike a match one day and you're like, oh, fire.
Yeah, and even so, I mean, have you ever tried to light a campfire with just one match? Very few people can do it.
No, yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
Too wet, or the shavings are too big, or you can't get the thing light. You know, it's a really complicated technology, and it requires knowledge. But the knowledge required to carry fire and kind of curate it and maintain it is a little bit less complicated. And then the knowledge
Yeah.
required to just kind of find it and use it is a little bit less complicated. And so, you know, that I feel like is one of those technologies that had to have built up over, you know, quite a long time of knowledge transmission to be able to get to the point where you're actually making it.
And the knowledge transmission is so key to making us such cultural beings, because at some point you end up having humans, our ancestors, living in a situation where they absolutely depend on pre-processed food, whether it's sliced or cooked or whatever, and learning to cook food is not in our genes. So we become cultural beings by necessity. I mean, it becomes just who we are. And I guess that brings us forward in the story, but it doesn't quite bring us to sapiens. So maybe we just need to fast forward, because I really want to get to the origin of anatomically modern humans. That happens. This is, by the way, this has been made so easy for the students, because this happens not 3 million years ago, but 300,000 years ago. So 10% of that, around that time, what was going on? I know that we don't even know where, if we might have even been just one place, but can you take us to where you think we should be imagining ourselves, if we imagine us being in the very, very early population of Homo sapiens? Where are we? What are we doing? What's happened that's made us suddenly appear out of nowhere? Well, not out of nowhere, but
This is another one of those, you know, gosh, we have a very big continent to look for this evidence.
But at least here we're pretty confident we have one continent, right? That it has to be somewhere in Africa.
Yes, yes, definitely somewhere in Africa, and in the kind of, I guess, the two main ends of the spectrum of, you know, hypotheses about that are that it was a place in Africa versus all places in Africa. So the a place in Africa camp, you know, there are a number of different potential places where people are looking for kind of a, you know, a homeland sort of situation, and what would that environment look like. But I tend to take the view that by that point, humans were very well adapted to wherever they wanted to live. And that was, in fact, one of the things that made us human. So we were all over the place in Africa in lots of different environments. We were in the high elevations, mountains of Ethiopia, where you would find it extremely cold and uncomfortable to go today. You know, we were in the coastlines. We were living along lake shores. We were out in the savannah in the open. We were in deserts. You find evidence of early modern humans in terms of the archaeological stone tools that they left behind in every environment. What I think surprised me was this emerging realization that humans are really good at making other humans. And I know that that sounds trite and maybe a bit strange, but I think because, and this is probably one of those biases of, you know, sort of middle class white Americana, but I always thought of people as being really invested in their offspring and maybe not having that many children because they are so intensive to raise. And those are all true, but at the same time, this weird paradox where humans are like unusually fertile and able to have a lot of children. And I'm sure you've probably addressed this in other podcasts, but to me, I always thought of this long-term trajectory of humans, their relationship to their environment, and population growth as being, well, obviously humans are going to be limited by the fact that we grow really, really slowly, and Therefore, it would like take us a really long time to actually expand and spread. And I think that was just a total fallacy. We will always make more humans very rapidly, and I'm sure all of the economists are aware of this, and Malthus was aware of this, but the mechanism of it was what was really surprising to me. You know, this ability that humans have to stack their offspring, right? So unlike other primates, we don't, well, unlike most everything else, we don't go through one and then get them out, independent, and then move on to the next one. We just do it all at the same time, simultaneously. And there is not another primate that does that. And so we can just have 10 or more children, all dependent on us at the same time at different ages. And then also kind of supplying their own sustenance to a certain extent and then helping each other, which links into a lot of your alloparenting that you've talked about with other guests previously.
Yeah, if moms would be left alone, they would not be able to pull it off.
No.
I'm surprised moms can pull off whatever they're doing already, but they do need help. Sarah Blaffer Hrdy's work, of course, on that is super important scientifically, but also inspirational.
And this is actually, it makes me wonder at what point, for example, did alloparenting actually become essential? Austrolopithecins walking around on two legs, it's not going to be able to have its offspring cling to it the way that chimps do. They're going to have to at some point be carrying their kids. And carrying kids, we know from a number of other researchers' work, is expensive. It's energetically expensive to do that. And so you have to somehow, this whole package had to have co-evolved of being a cooperative forager who is able to access new kinds of resources whilst keeping their children safe. And then these children are actually less able to manage on their own than previously because of all of the expense of growing a larger brain.
Exactly. Yeah, longer childhoods for the brain growth. So you really need some maybe the dad, maybe the grandmother, who knows, but someone needs to be helped.
So this whole like human capacity, it's this paradox of being this incredibly expensive type of organism, and yet at the same time being able to produce so many of us. Normally that violates the majority of ecological laws, right?
Yeah, no, it really does. How can we have such long childhoods and such short birth intervals?
Yep. It's a real reversal. And every other mammal, the bigger the brain, the lower the fertility. Every other mammal, you have this kind of relationship between your brain size and your fertility and then your population size. So there's going to be fewer of you on the landscape. You're going to require more resources. Again, big brains, right, require a lot of resources to feed, but humans somehow just like violate that. That I think is our biggest evolutionary trick is our ability to manage to simultaneously be a very expensive organism to maintain and yet also be able to have so many of us. So I just kind of like thinking about how in many ways of our biology and many ways of our behavior, we really, these things co-evolve with each other. And I feel like we are the species that has engineered its own evolution. We engineer environments, and I think we've been increasingly doing so over quite a long trajectory. And I think we've also kind of engineered our own evolution, right? We've directed our own biology through our behavior over many, many, many generations to be able to handle having more children, handle having bigger brains, handle being able to live in a wider range of environments. These are all things that I think are a part of why it is that humans are so different from other animals.
Do you think Homo sapiens is somehow a break away from what came before, or just one more step towards, we get bigger brains, and eventually we do get sapiens and Neanderthals, and for whatever reason, sapiens is the one that's still around? Are we just a kind of continuation of that long trajectory from the Austrolopithecines to the early Homo onwards, or is there something that makes us different?
So now we're getting into philosophy.
We can do it philosophy, but also just in terms of what you see, does the archaeological record suddenly change in the way we react to environment or the way we modify environment, or is it just more of the same?
Yeah, no, there's an acceleration. There's a very clear acceleration in the pace at which we invent things and the scale at which we do things and the population growth of humans. It's definitely not a straight line. You know, it's an exponential change in all of these attributes. And so I think that it's all possible because of this long lead up, but that what we're doing now is different. I do think it is qualitatively different and quantitatively different from what would have been possible even for our Homo sapiens ancestors a few tens of thousands of years ago, because all of that accumulated cultural knowledge, all of that accumulated ability to change and engineer environments. I think it's all part of the story. I think the lead up was necessary, and that without the bigger brain, you know, early on with Homo, and without the tool use, and without the change in diet, and without eventually getting into fire, and all of the changes that had to have happened with respect to our cooperative behaviors, to our tool use, I think all of those things had to have happened, and happened in a way that kind of self-accelerated many of those same behaviors because they were very successful. But every one of these behaviors can't just kind of emerge out of nowhere. It requires all of the scaffolding. Kind of like how you can't have a super fertile, large-brained primate without alloparenting, right? Without others to help. And so it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It all has to be related. And then I think that what we've seen is that humans have got to the point where we just continuing to accelerate a lot of the behaviors we're doing, but we're doing it in a exponential way. And now we're starting to find that um, it is really problematic on a global scale. The kinds of things that have always worked for us well before haven't necessarily kept us in any sort of balance with, you know, with the natural environment around us, but we've been able to compensate, and it's been able to compensate. And now I think that our level of this kind of number of people and the exploitation of our environment is on a scale that is clearly not seen before, and it's happened fast.
I think that's a really good place to start coming to a close. So always my final question. How was well, your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
My outlook on humanity is probably overly positive. I I'm an optimist, and I think that we some of our greatest strengths are also some of our greatest weaknesses. When doing research on the emergence and origins of humans, modern Homo sapiens, what makes us different, what makes us similar to our ancestors, one of the things that always emerges from that is just how incredibly reliant we are on culture to be human, and how crucial that is to everything that we do. And one of the aspects of that that seems to have been really successful is this in-group, out-group propensity that humans have. So we use cultural signifiers to decide who's in our group. So we don't have to personally know each and every individual to feel an affinity for them. We can look at what they're wearing or what language they're speaking, or, you know, any other number of cultural markers, and say, "Ah, yeah, that's somebody who I should cooperate with." And then we have this ability to cooperate on the scale that transcends the small groups of people that we know. And that's what actually has led to some of humanity's greatest achievements and innovations. It's also got the dark side, right? The shadow side is that when you have an in group, you also have an out group. You also have those who you don't choose to cooperate with, those who you don't identify with. And it's really difficult to imagine having one without the other. So our I think our greatest strength is also probably our greatest fault. And that, again, when you think about our relationship to environments, it's the same kind of thing where our ability to thrive, not just survive, but thrive in so many different kinds of environments is one of the most amazing stories, and something I think we should be kind of proud of. But it does have this exploitation aspect that is not going to do us any favors if it continues on the scale that it has been. So I guess what my research makes me think about humans is that we need to be better at leveraging our strengths and also acknowledging that they have a shadow side and just being more aware of what that looks like when we try to imagine, I guess, the future evolution of humans, right? Because we're going to go somewhere and the question is where. And I think one lesson that we get from all of this is we get to decide uniquely. Other organisms don't have that kind of agency to decide their own future, but humans do. And because of that, we're in a really strong position to make decisions that are either going to really benefit our species or really not.
Jessica Thompson, thank you very, very much. Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this, definitely hit the subscribe button. Feel free to rate the show if you feel that I deserve it, and share the episode forward if you think that more people would enjoy it. If you're new to the show and you want more about human evolution, there's plenty in the archives, but especially you should check March of this year and the whole 5-part series on the origins of humankind. And stay tuned for next week when we'll hear from historian Tirthankar Roy about how water and the weather played a role in the origins of European colonialism. Until then, take care.